Welcome to A Really Good Sex Chat, a podcast aiming to open up conversations about disability and sexuality. I'm your host, Candice Care-Unger, psychosexual therapist and specialist social worker at Care Rehab. Join us as we have frank conversations about sexuality, disability, fertility, pleasure, dating, and everything in between. This podcast is brought to you by Care Rehab and recorded on Darug land. In this episode, we chat with Dr Mitchell Tepper, sexuality educator and coach, researcher on pleasure and orgasm, and author of Regain That Feeling: Secrets to Sexual Self-Discovery. Dr Tepper has also created a documentary called Love After War that provides insights on restoring emotional and physical intimacy after serious combat-related injuries. Our discussion is about rediscovering sex and connectedness following an injury. Specifically, we talk about ejaculation and spinal cord injury. We talk about breath, energy, tantra, and orgasm. Hey, Dr. Mitch Tepper, how are you going?
Great. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining us on A Really Good Sex Chat. It's so nice to have you all the way from Atlanta on our podcast today. And I'm curious, for our friends who are listening at home who maybe don't know you yet, maybe you could just introduce yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm Dr. Mitchell Tepper. I identify as a sexologist, which means I'm very curious about sex and I study sex scientifically. And so I'm a sex researcher, educator, and coach.
And you also live with spinal cord injury as well, right?
Of course, yeah. So, I was injured in 1982. So that's 42 years ago. July 27th, I'll celebrate or remember, observe, whatever. 42 years post-injury, and it was secondary to a diving accident when I was a lifeguard.
So you came into this work in sexology after your injury, or was it something that you were doing before your injury?
When I broke my neck, I was between my junior and senior year in college, in business school. So I went off and I actually started a career in banking. That wasn't floating my boat. I was very involved with what we call now United Spinal Association. And through that, I was recruited to sell durable medical equipment. So I sold wheelchairs for a while, which I liked because I was in a major rehab hospital and that was my client. So I get to see people when they were newly injured. And I was also very active, as I mentioned, in this organization. So I was able to give people information and really much more than just fitting them for a good wheelchair.
Share your lived experience and
recruiting them into the United Spinal Association and giving them information and getting them involved in things outside the hospital when they left. So I did that for a while, and I was actually encouraged to go back to school. So I went back to school to Yale to get a master's in public health because, I lived near Yale and some people on the board of our organization were from Yale, and they were doing some research on methylprednisone and, steroids, in the neck to reduce inflammation and reduce injury after whatever. But they said they were doing stuff about spinal cord injury, and they encouraged me to go. And I, went to program in health policy and administration with the thought I wanted to come out and run a rehab hospital.
Okay.
And then I had a little stint in working in rehab while I was still working on my degree. And at the time in the United States, it wasn't much different than banking. They put me in administration, and I was looking at finances and what other hospitals were doing because of certain law changes in our country. And so I still was very far away from the patient, from other people, which really I liked. I did my master's thesis on the provision of sexuality education and counseling in spinal cord injury rehab programs in the United States. And I sent that out to the first 500 people on our list. No emails at that time. We had to mail people stuff and get it back with paper. And folks at the rehab hospital said, no one's going to answer your questions. They're too sensitive. And my professor at Yale said, don't worry about it. He was actually a nurse in World War II. And he said, if they don't answer it, if you don't get a good response, we'll talk about how this is a sensitive issue. And I got a very strong response, people writing in, answering my questions, asking questions. And I was really thought, well, this is what I should be doing. And I ended up, instead of going into, rehab management, I went in and got my PhD in human sexuality education.
Mm.
And then from there, I went off and, created my own career path. For 15 years, I had a website called sexualhealth.com. And it really, 1996 was novel, making information available on the click of the mouse, ending the silence. You could see it now in the literature. Other people talk about ending the silence, but I talked about ending the silence around sexuality and disability, and that was in 96. And so
Yeah,
that really
wow.
was doing a good job in it because I reached really millions and millions of people over the years with different disabilities. It wasn't just spinal cord injuries. There was all kinds of disabilities. So yeah, I had experts from all over the world answering questions.
Oh, it's so good. I know your work has definitely been a very
So
important foundation for my learning and for trying to get my head around things when I came into rehab and sexuality work. So thank you for paving the way. I feel like I'm talking to a living legend here. And I'm really curious, kind of, what are some of the most common things that people talk to you about in your work? Like, what are the common issues that are coming through that people are worried about or thinking about?
well, for men, hands down, the most common thing that people want to learn from me is like how to ejaculate again. If someone isn't having a reflex erection, also erection is way up there. But ejaculation is one that it's easier to find a doctor that could help you with an erection, right? But there's not any doctors that are really helping people learn how to regain that ability to ejaculate. And there are my colleagues up in Canada, but it's generally not a part of rehab, at least in the United States.
Yeah, okay. So
So
ejaculation function
ejaculation is
is
very, very important to men.
yeah. Why?
Why? You think about spreading your seed, it's putting yourself out there into the next generation, into the world, right? That's your legacy, right? Is one. So that I think at the core, that ability to reproduce and be a father is something maybe we don't think about before injury, especially if we're young. But once we're injured, I know I did. I wanted to know, am I ever going to be able to have a baby? I mean, it was one of my first questions, although I wasn't thinking about having a kid at the time. Second, I'm going to say it's uniquely masculine. Although women can ejaculate, defining feature of male sexuality is ejaculation. So unless you answer questions on a website like sexualhealth.com for years, you would never know that one of men's biggest questions without disabilities is the volume of their ejaculate, is the color of their ejaculate, is the consistency of it, is it liquidy, is it too thick, and how forceful it is. And so like from older guys I get, well, I don't really can't shoot as far as I used to. So we're really focused on this process and on this phenomenon. It's a defining aspect of sexuality. It's also important to partners. I call it the ejaculation affirmation, because I think we're all kind of, unless we learn a lot, we're all kind of sexually insecure. We all want to be able to please a partner, right? And in a heterosexual relationship, I guess it would be the same with a man-to-man relationship, but in a heterosexual relationship, ejaculation is a signal to the partner that you please them. And so after injury, sometimes when there's no ejaculation, partners are confused and they believe that the person with the spinal cord injury, the man in this context, is maybe hasn't been pleased yet, even though maybe in their head they learned that this might be because of the spinal cord injury. But yet, we all have sexual scripts, and sexual scripts are like, we'll use the baseball analogy. At least in this country, it works. People talk about first base. Do they do that in Australia too? Did you get to first,
Yeah.
second,
Mhm.
third, home run? So that's a script. We're gonna kiss, touch the breast, put our finger down there, make sure she's wet, and then intercourse, right? The home run. And men learn to be very goal directed, right? They work towards ejaculation and orgasm, right? And so when those things don't happen, then we feel very lost. And the same thing for a partner. If she doesn't know that you're satisfied, sometimes she doesn't believe you. So I
Mm.
have to counsel people and say, you have to be honest about what you're feeling and how satisfied you are or you aren't, right? And you have to reiterate that. And sometimes maybe you have to, start vocalizing during sex and letting your partner know, oh, this feels good, and oh, I'm getting excited. Some
Some feedback.
affirmation for them. some feedback to the partner, especially early on when they don't know and they're insecure. So it becomes an important part of somebody's script, and when it's missing, people are lost. So I often, when I'm working, with injured veterans, so if a veteran has peak post-traumatic stress or brain injury or both, right, they're on 8, 10, 12 drugs, right? And so many of them have erectile dysfunction, ejaculatory dysfunction, and the partner would say, well, what do I do, doc, if he can't finish? Once again, that's a question about the script. It's got nothing to do with spinal cord injury. In this case, it's got to do with side effects of medication. I spend a lot of time talking to people about ejaculation, and so there's a protocol, established by Friederike Courtois. Excuse me if I didn't get her last name right. She's a dear friend, but from Canada. They encourage people while they're still in the rehab hospital to masturbate, and so they're one that gives the patient the real strong message that sex is important and we're going to work on it here, right? And so that's one signal. And so they're asked to masturbate and to report, what they find. And if masturbation alone doesn't lead to ejaculation, then they start with the vibrator, right? And so if the vibrator doesn't work, then they add, in this case, I believe midodrine, a drug that will help with your kind of like Sudafed, midodrine. And so they get a really, higher percentage than the literature of men ejaculating when they follow this protocol. That's
just
an
off-the-shelf vibrator that they're starting with.
I share study in the hospital. They're using a modified vibrator off the shelf, but I used an off-the-shelf vibrator to have my child, and I wrote about that in New Mobility magazine. It was called Making Babies, Vibrostimulation and At-Home Insemination. So I did that ejaculation and insemination all from home. So it could be an over-the-counter vibrator. And since they're cheaper, I tell people maybe you should see if it works first before you spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on either, the FertiCare tool, which is a medical vibrator, or the Vibrorect. Supposedly there are similar outcomes with the FertiCare being better, but the FertiCare 2, I believe, is more reliable than the Vibrorect. The Vibrorect is a two-headed vibrator, but it's not quite as strong, the motors. But often someone will use two vibrators, one on the underside of the penis and one on the top, right? And so that tool allows you to do both. Pleasure-wise, if you have sensation.
I think one of the questions I get a lot is, what are we actually stimulating there? Like when we're using the FertiCare underneath on the frenulum, what's happening? Why does it work?
Ejaculation is a reflex. We have different nerves innervating the genital. We have a pelvic and pudendal nerve, and then the hypogastric nerve that creates, and it's counterintuitive, but the higher your injury is, the stronger your erection, right? So when we talk about reflex erections, it's like when you burn your hand and your hand comes off the fire and it doesn't register that you're burned a few seconds later, and it's like, ow, but your hand reflexively moves. So those things, the reflexes, same thing like our spasms, the reflexes happen off of our spine, not from our brain. So these are very primitive responses that we have, right? And so we get reflexes, spasticity. If we get burned, right, we have reflexes. The reflex for the genital, or for the penis and erection, right, it's really, the nerves actually stimulate the arteries and the arteries put out blood, which causes the erection. So the nerves, except for the somatic nerve that does muscles, but the nerve is controlling the blood flow via the artery. The more there is a spinal cord, sacrothoracic cord intact, so the more cord that is intact, the stronger the reflexes. And then ejaculation and erection sometimes are mediated through the hypogastric nerve plexus, and that would be for thoughts going down. So we call that, psychogenic erections. So a lot of people who have injuries will get reflex erections, right? Like higher level injuries will get reflex erections, but no if it's complete, no input from their mind. Their erotic thoughts are not translating into an erection.
It's like when people talk about getting a reflex with like a catheter change, changing their clothes, or even with a transfer, like it's a bit of the just with
Yeah.
the movement.
Range of motion, where you're ranging their legs, all that is just right off. The penis feels a stimulation, right? And that stimulation goes to the spine. And our basic function of stimulation is to get an erection, and that happens, right? So that's the reflex. And like I said, there's psychogenic stuff that comes through the hypogastric nerve. So someone with an injury that's lower, they may not get any reflex erection, but they may get emission, and they may get a leakage of some semen, right, or ejaculate, right, because that can come through psychogenic excitement through the hypogastric nerve. So without an erection, they could get some seminal, emission. And so it's really, one, it's counterintuitive, because you would think the higher up, the more, quote unquote, disabled the guy is, the more, he's going to have sexual problems. But I mean, I really come across a number of quads over my career that have babies without assistance. They ejaculate through intercourse without assistance. It's certainly in the minority, but it's not impossible. That's
Oh,
so we get
absolutely.
the reflex versus the psychogenic, and I coach people into trying to help them,
Maximizing.
get where they want as far as with ejaculation. Long term, I try to move their focus into pleasure, and then all orgasms that are maybe accessed differently, not just from the genitals. But it's important to recognize what people's primary concerns are and work with that first. If a guy
Yeah.
tells me, I got a problem getting erection and ejaculation, and I'm like, don't worry about that. That's old news. Let's just move on and be, focus on pleasure. And he's not going to listen to me. Right.
Now you've
So
missed him.
since there are some potential solutions, I work on where they want to work on first, and then we work on, moving towards expanding their horizons, giving
Yeah.
them more different ways to access pleasure.
Other tools. So just to go back,
Mhm.
the protocol would be try manual stimulation with the hand. If that does nothing, try an off-the-shelf vibrator. If that kind of doesn't really provide the outcome, and I put that in inverted commas because that's like the real ejaculation focus. But then the next protocol would
Right.
be a vibro ejaculation, medical grade. And then I guess some of the work that
Right.
you've written about in the past too has sort of talked a little bit about electrical stim and e-stim and electro nut therapy. And I'm just curious, what is that? Could you explain a
Electro
little bit about?
electro nut busting. That's the term that somebody on a discussion board, Care Cope discussion board, put up for using your TENS or your neuromuscular stimulation to illicit ejaculation. And so I went through, dozens of people's stories, and asked questions. And so what it turns out is that people seem to be having, at least in this very small population of, 30, 40 men, better luck ejaculating with a $35 electrical unit, than a $700-800 medical vibrator. They both have this potential dangerous side effect of autonomic dysreflexia,
Yeah.
right? So either the vibrator or the electrical stim can do that. They both have issues where, if you overdo it, you could have problems with your skin or et cetera. But yeah, so they were experimenting using their electrical pads and putting them on the penis, and trying to elicit ejaculation, and people were having success. So, I mean, it's not so crazy. I mean, with traditional old-fashioned ways of reproduction and spinal cord injury, they would do rectal probe ejaculation, which was putting an
Mhm.
electrode in your rectum and stimulating the nerves around the prostate to see if you could get what we call an antegrade ejaculation. So a lot of guys are ejaculating inwards, so we call it a retrograde ejaculation. So they don't see it until maybe they cath and they could see cloudiness in the urine, see some white in the urine. But we do know that they use electrical stimulation directly in the anus to elicit this. So it certainly makes sense that electrical stim would work. I wrote an article about that and shared information about what
so
type of
much of this
people
stuff comes so much of this stuff comes from the grassroots, like from the community, and the community sharing what have you tried and what have you tried. And it's very difficult to get
absolutely.
a lot of
That's
these
how I learned.
interventions. It's how
The
you
first
learned?
time I ever ejaculated was with a vibrator because I learned it from another guy.
Yeah, okay. So I think what I have heard over the last few years
So,
in this space is how much, peers chat to one another, people with lived experience are kind of sharing gems, but a lot of it doesn't make it into peer-reviewed published literature. And so the health professionals maybe are either a little bit hesitant to implement such a strategy because there's no evidence that it's going to work, or they don't know about it because it hasn't made its way into peer-reviewed publication. And so um, a lot of that learning at the grassroots translates into it's just sharing of knowledge. And so when you're thinking about how do you spread the word to other people so that way there's because there's a lot of suffering of not knowing what to do and feeling very stressed, and then when someone finds an option that works for them,
mhm.
a lot of like I'd say the words probably just a celebration but also relief, like oh my god, there's something here, there's an option here. And so how do we
Yeah,
translate that into
it's
community
like a load
knowledge?
is taken off your back. Well, I mean, for years I was doing it through sexualhealth.com and had really
Of course.
hundreds and hundreds of thousands of users every month. And also for 10 years, I wrote, a column through New Mobility called Love Bites. I have some videos up. They're old now, but Sex and Paralysis video series on drmitchelltepper.com. Basically, using social media, the internet, has been one great way to disseminate information. The protocol for masturbation is actually published. I was actually trying to get some other rehab hospital to do the research on the electrical stim, the nut busting, because health professionals would be most concerned about is safety. But as I said, a vibrostim, they have similar risks. You don't want to put electrodes on your chest because you could actually throw off your heart. So that would be one major concern. But as far as if we're using them, around our penis, the base of our penis, on our penis, under the scrotum, in the perineum, you just have, let's say, reasonable risks.
Reasonable risk. And I guess what I'm trying to conceptualize here is what that would do is contract the pelvic floor muscles. And through contracting the pelvic floor muscles, it's eliciting more tension. That's kind of the aim of it. Or have I missed it completely?
Now, you've got probably half of it.
Hmm.
Sexual response, like when we're getting excited, is a combination of blood flow and neuromuscular tension that you're talking about, right? And so when there's a buildup of tension and then a release, sometimes that's associated with orgasm, right? There are some intricate things that have to happen for ejaculation, right? And that is a nervous thing, and it's a muscular contraction. That's once again, it's a reflex. I don't think we could do it, but we can facilitate that through the neuromuscular tension. So that's why, in addition to using a vibrator or a TENS unit, we often have people put their legs in a frog leg position, with their feet together, heels together, knees out, because that increases the tension in the groin. And then also has been shown that adding electrical stim to the abs also increases the probability that you ejaculate. And an able-bodied guy, when he ejaculates and has an orgasm, he would be able to feel that like muscular contractions go up the ab. It just feeds into the other reflexes, that will then make that ejaculatory reflex, which is different, will help basically trigger that.
Yeah, a lot of my clients will talk about their abs kicking off and having some spasm in their abdominal right before they ejaculate, or then nothing happens. They think, oh, well, that was all very anticlimactic. And that's when I usually say, well, check your catheter because there could be that, like you were talking about, the retrograde ejaculation. So the abdominal muscles are almost a bit of a key. And I know you talk a little bit about recognizing signs of arousal after a spinal cord injury. And abdominal spasm would be recognizing a sign of arousal, right? What other signs do you encourage people to look for?
In addition to what we increase in blood flow, which we notice is, an erect penis or a lubricated vagina or erect clitoris, whatever, in addition to those genital changes, which some of us may be totally cut off from if we have a complete injury, there's an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, a sex flush. So there's a warmth, right, that comes up. We could see our hair, stand on end, goose flesh, nipples erect, right? All of these things are signs of sexual arousal. So if someone can't feel the arousal below their level of injury, even if they can, I try to help people tune into the other sensations, right? And affirm that those are also sexual arousal. And then add to that breathing, well, increase in respiration is part of it, but a lot of people hold their breath during sex, so it's not going to help get you more aroused. So one is to really focus on helping people breathe freely and deeply and naturally, and that naturally may change from slow to fast, and breath does all kinds of different things. And then also making sounds, because sound brings energy upwards, right? And so when I talk about alternative ways of accessing orgasm, that's through I call it whatever, the sexual energy system, right? So we'll call it tantra, and they speak of chakras, right? But chakras, scientifically, if you look at the chakras, like let's talk about at the base, the perineum, right? There's a lot of nerves there, so you could actually scientifically look like Western medicine and Eastern medicine and see how it really overlaps, just with a different orientation. But the thing about the energy body is that you can feel it like beyond your body, right? So like for exercises, like in a tantra workshop, people shake and then stop,
Yeah.
and then you could feel the vibrations, right? And those vibrations you could feel beyond your hands, right? And then I get people to like, okay, put your hands together to where you could feel the warmth, and then okay, see if you could stretch that. So I get people to begin to focus on things that are beyond their body. And what we know, like from studying orgasm in women in a laboratory, and these are women with complete injuries, is that when they had their orgasm, they felt it all over. They felt their orgasm felt like their orgasm before. We're not talking about, I felt these contractions in my pubococcygeal G muscles and the muscles around my vagina, my pelvic floor. It was the sensation, the bliss, whatever you want to call it, ecstasy, when they describe their orgasm, compared to able-bodied controls. Blind reviewers, the reviewers who can't see whether it's the description of a woman with spinal cord injury or not, couldn't tell the difference between an able-bodied woman's description of her orgasm and a woman with a spinal cord injury, complete spinal cord injuries, her description of an orgasm. And that was true in both our labs with Doctors Beverly Whipple and Barry Komisarek, and it was also true in the labs with Mark Kasipsky. She was at Kessler. There's two significant studies of orgasm in women with spinal cord injury. The one in our lab had only women with complete injuries at certain levels because we were looking at nerve input. The one in Dr. Sipsky or Dr. Alexander, I think she's using Alexander now, but they took complete and incomplete women. So they got a little different results. They had a larger percentage of women experiencing orgasm. We had, 3 out of 15. They had nearly 50%. In the other protocol at Kessler, they allowed women to use whatever they want. They could use a vibrator. They could bring a partner. In our protocol, they had to stimulate their cervix for so long, and we had a special tool for that. They had to stimulate the anterior wall of their vagina and then an area above, but they couldn't bring in their own tools. They couldn't bring, or toys. They couldn't bring in their own partners. So we had a little lower, but we still were able. But we also had measurements of pinprick and temperature tolerance, and we had scientific measurements and also heat. We can't really get into why each one of those, and an analog say, oh, I'm having an orgasm, and saying, on a 1 to 10 scale. Plus we were measuring pupil dilation. So we had a lot of things we were measuring to confirm the orgasm, as
Yeah,
far as,
kind of more Masters and
when you're
Johnson
publishing,
style.
people would say, oh, it's not a real orgasm. Yes, really, it was. It is. It was. Yeah, definitely. We Beverly Whipple and Barry Komisarek have an orgasm laboratory, and I wasn't involved, but the next step was to do the fMRI studies of the brain and see, that yes, there really is an orgasmic response. And if you look at the orgasm in women with spinal cord injury and without in the brain, they light up the same. I tell you from personal experience and other guys that it's true that you don't need general stimulation or even feeling down there to get an orgasm.
Let's talk about non-genital orgasm for a moment here, because I think a lot of people misunderstand that ejaculation and orgasm are not the same thing. The orgasm is more experienced in the brain, and the ejaculation is a spinal reflex. Can you talk to me a little bit about
You know,
non-genital orgasm?
yeah, so I want to just kind of get rid of that dichotomy of just in the brain or just in the body,
Sure.
because orgasm is actually felt more, it's brain mediated, which means that when I talk about just in general pleasure, and I often use the airs because people say, oh, if you have a complete injury, we get a hypersensitive area. And then there also, different parts become more erotic. And so some people can have orgasms through stimulation of their air, right? And so that may be true in the right context when you're already aroused. But if I come up from behind you and I stick my tongue in your ear, right?
Yes.
Or in a more ugly example, unwanted sex, right?
Mm, mm,
So
mm, mm.
if someone touches you and it's wanted, it's welcome. It could be very pleasurable. If someone touches you and it's unwanted, you recoil, you tighten up, you don't want it. So tongue in your ear, same hand on your breast or wherever, but totally different response. Orgasm is a brain mediated event where ejaculation is a reflex, which is really working off of your sacral thoracic spine. Orgasm is a brain mediated event, but it's also, I'll call it an energetic event. And like an energy orgasm, right? We're talking about moving sexual energy, or you call it the life force, right? And or kundalini, and it's stored in our base, and like our root. They call it the root chakra, like between the anus and men, and between the scrotum, So, but we have, like I said, nerve endings there, but we have energy that's stored and that can be moved. And when the energy moves, it moves us. It actually animates us, and it actually, when it's built up and released, it's orgasmic. It takes practice to be able to slow down, to be able to receive, to be able to focus on what's pleasurable. But if you talk to a lot of women, like men too, but heard more women describing who have complete injuries, that they would just focus on the tiniest of sensation or feeling, and they would let that grow. And they could do that to having an orgasm, right? And that's coming through both brain, and the sensation is energy. It's kind of a release of energy. And so that's those orgasms. There's, if you watch, there's workshops now, at least in the United States, teaching people how to activate this energy and have orgasms. So they're in a workshop, men and women clothed. These are able-bodied people standing up, but they're basically helping people, breathe and move and tap into those energy centers, and then they help activate each other. So they just touch each other, and you'll see it's not fake, because I've had these response all the time on the table, right, on a massage table. So, but they're having these uncontrollable kind of shakes and responses, and the other person is moving with their hands and moving their energy around, and these things could go on for a long time, not just seconds or minutes. I think it's going to catch on. I mean, we're talking about something that's been around, tantra, for thousands of years. Very soon after I broke my neck, when I was like looking all over for anything I could learn on my own about sex, so I started experimenting in the hospital with my nurse, and with my roommate's sister, and I was just wanted to know what's going to happen. I asked questions. I wasn't happy. I went and found out what I can. I got this real little book once called Tantra, Spirituality, and Sex in my earlier days, after seeing some things that I rejected, not in that book, but in books about love and talking about injuries. And I'm like, it didn't seem true to me. I read this book, and I'm like, if I still have it to this day with all these stickers on it, because it just spoke to me. It just spoke to me, and from there, I just started reading more. And there was this guy, unfortunately, he passed away recently, Kenneth Ray Stubbs. He used to do erotic massage videos, but he had Secret Garden Publishing, and he published a lot on tantra. So I watched his films in graduate school, and then he had a central cord injury, and we got to know each other. And like I'm like, I'm doing a workshop. I want to be able. So he helped me create my workshops. I have a whole shelf of my library dedicated to him because he would always send me his newest books. And he moved beyond there before he died into really into energy bodies, but also light bodies, which we're not going to get into. But he didn't like where like Western Tantra was going, and what some of the focus on more style, where Tantra is really just a philosophy. It's not. You don't have to get into strange positions or put animals up your butt. My accessible Tantra workshop I call mindfulness and the yoga of sex. People accept mindfulness, but its roots are exactly the same as Tantra, right? But because Tantra has been associated with sex, it remains taboo. Mindfulness is now a big psychological practice, right? Staying in the moment, quieting down, slowing down, focusing, and then connecting. And yoga is about breath. It's about being able to breathe and bring that breath in and centering yourself, and then being able to focus then on another and connect. So those are the type of things that make sex better than just being physical. Brings in different aspects of both energy and spirituality. It's hard to explain how one person can after their injury feel like sex is pointless, why bother, and they have different experiences. But then when they're with somebody, they find someone that they trust and feel safe with, they feel a sense of connectiveness, and in that context they experience pleasure and orgasm for the first time. So we can't scientifically measure this concept of connectiveness, and since I believe like we all yearn for connection, and this trust and safety and connectiveness have the power to overcome any physical loss, to create this pleasure and even the ability to have orgasm again. So many people that I did my research with, men, said their orgasm happened by surprise because they didn't have the same precursors. They didn't feel what was going on. Well, her hand was down there, but she was also kissing my neck, or I was getting a massage, and then all of a sudden, often because they're expecting A, B, and C, and they're not getting that anymore, but they're also in the moment with someone they trust. They let their guard down, they let themselves be vulnerable, and that kind of stuff that's going on creates pleasure. Just on the reverse side, I talked to a lot of guys who masturbated to ejaculate, and they finally ejaculated and they were happy about it, but they didn't feel it at all. It just felt like wet. So there was no orgasm. So you could trigger an ejaculation. I have to say that whether you feel it or not, there is a feeling with ejaculation of satiation, right? So to feel like it's done, like, unless you're going to ejaculate again, when you ejaculate, sometimes it wears you out, especially as you get older, right? So there's a feeling of satiation. And so I try not to make orgasm as a goal, right? So like sex could be great without orgasm too. But if you're feeling like still charged up, like you're not finished, I recommend people use a vibrator anyway, because sometimes a vibrator will get you to the point of satiation even without ejaculation, right? So it will still make you feel like, you like a beat, maybe, and in a happy way,
Which has got that kind of glazy afterflow, which is, that real hormonal response, which some people are looking
right.
for. I kind of talk about it like, what's the point of sex in your relationship as well? Like, or what's the point of sex, full stop? It might not be in a relationship. And, it's different for different people. And so if they're really seeking that sort of like stress management, tension release, kind of self-soothing, well, that's a very different
Mm-hmm.
type of sex, right? Compared to someone who's looking to bond and have more intimacy with another person. And so I can see what you're talking about here in terms of tantra and breath and connectedness in coupled sex or with partnered sex. So many options. And I think that's one of the things that I like to kind of provide the clients that I work with, is that there's hope, like it's not all over Red Rover. It's
You could actually get to that point without a partner too.
yeah,
With practice, you could get to the point of activating your sexual energy and having orgasms without even a partner too. So you could do it on yourself, and so you're connecting with yourself, and you're focusing in on your pleasure, right? So I always say with the right
absolutely.
intention and pay enough attention, anything could be orgasmic.
Yeah, intention and attention. Yeah, and
Yeah,
there's a variety of pathways to that.
right.
Yeah. Woof. We talked about a lot of things. There's one more thing I wanted to chat with you about today, and that was working with couples who were together before their accident. And kind of what advice or strategies do you give people who are going through this adjustment together and are going through there's grief, there's trauma, there's a whole bunch of other emotions going on, and just what your advice is for people who are starting out together in a new journey.
I try to get to understand what their sexual script was before their injury, right? What they liked, what they didn't like, and what was typical for them, right? And then I try to explain to them what scripts are and help them write new stories. So I try to have them come and I remind them, which is, I'm getting old and it doesn't work this way anymore for a lot of people, but I remind them that, like, to try to think back when they were younger before they had intercourse, when they first were being sexual with somebody, and the days when people kissed and touched each other's bodies before they had intercourse. Now people have intercourse, so quickly. I don't know if everyone's had a period in their life where they just kissed and made out and fondled each other and fingered each other and whatever. But I tried to say, take yourself back to those days, like you're a virgin, but like go back to like you're a complete sexual novice and take this opportunity to be curious and explore and create a new script and maybe multiple scripts. And it's surprising the average person will be surprised of how many people have a better sex life after an injury than before. Because before their injury, I talked to women who didn't have orgasms before their injury, or they were harder to come by, and now they're easier. And so there's opportunity for post-traumatic growth, right? And there's opportunities for new learning and expanding people's sexual repertoire, right? Where I try to get them to come at this as newlyweds, as whatever, new partners with curiosity, as an opportunity to explore, share each other's what their fantasies are, and really, let go of what was, which is just all part of moving forward, right? Is like letting go of the comparison, which is one of the hardest things to do, right? Is to forget something that was cherished, right? But letting them know that there is still the opportunity for pleasure and orgasm, and it could even be better. So I just try to frame it that way, and then we work on experimentation. I talk about being creative and using their imagination, right? So creativity and taking the same skills that they use to adapt their situation, to adapt their bedroom, whatever, their chair, adaptability, adapt their positions. So the creativity, adaptability, and have them, keep a sense of humor, and keep things playful. So when we work too hard at sex, it's work and it's counterproductive because then we're not relaxed. So sex is this thing where you have to be relaxed to to get more tense, right? But it's a different kind of tense and it's not stress, right? So it's a buildup of excitement. But in order for that to happen, we have to be relaxed, we have to be vulnerable, open, and then that happens.
Yeah, I use the analogy of like, when you talk about sexual scripts, I talk about actors who have learnt their lines, they've perfected their lines, they come out on stage, they perform their lines, they do a beautiful performance, they've practiced it, they know exactly what's required, and they can, do it reliably. And then an injury might happen and suddenly you're the actor whose lines have been ripped up and we send you out on stage, and either you'll get stage fright because you've got nothing to draw upon, or you might learn the art of improvisation, or you kind of use the jazz analogy
Yeah.
of you've got your instruments and you just learn how to jam with them. And part of knowing how to play good jazz is knowing your instrument really well. And it might not be the same today and it probably won't be the same tomorrow, but does it mean that it's still cool? Yeah, sometimes it might not be. Sometimes it might be like, well, we won't do that again. But other times it might be like, well, that was just a really cool jam session. And so if people can move from being actors who have learnt their lines
Wow.
into being a jazz musician, then they'll probably appreciate the idea and the understanding of improvisation.
Yeah. Wow. I totally forgot years ago, one of the exercises I did when I worked directly with groups of people with disabilities, I put up some pictures of different instruments and I said, describe your sexuality, it wasn't just according to an instrument, a car, or a flower, right? So people could, whatever they relate to, if they like instruments or music, they could talk like I used to use. I'm an E flat alto sax. I'm sensual. I got a lot of range, right? And so um, if people like cars, then they know what kind of car, and if people like flowers, and then animals, right? So those are the 4 categories. I'm like, choose a category and describe your sexuality. And so very, very rich. And so I love what
That's
you're
cool.
doing there. So
Yeah, that's cool. I'm gonna take that one. I'm gonna borrow that. All right, Mitch. Let's bring this to a close because I think that we've covered so much amazingly rich content today, and I'm sure that the folks that are listening to us today will be like, "Whew, Mitch Tepper, where do I find his stuff?" And they can jump on Dr. Mitchell Tepper and check out your stuff. I love your sex and paralysis videos. Even though you just said they're a bit old, I still think they're fabulous. They're a great resource, and for many people, they need to be able to visualize. Well, what are my options if they've never watched adaptive sex? Very few people have thought
right.
about, if I have a disability, how would I still have sex? Until all of a sudden they have a disability, and people need some visual ideas to kind of start to build a new script. And so coming to your website, checking out some of the videos is very useful for helping to start to visualize, well, what would a new script maybe even start to look like? How could I physically do some of those things? So thank you very much for your work, and thank you very much for your time this morning,
Thank you.
being part of our podcast and our chat today. We'll catch you next time.
Great. Yeah. Hopefully in Australia.